Hello everyone, Mr. Roger Capello bringing you My Week at the Club, episode number 34 from the Wachusett Chess Club, and we're in the midst of a club championship cycle right now. And this particular game is a makeup game that I played in my house last Friday against Ken Gurge. And before I get into that game, which was postponed from round 2, I'd like to say a few words. Well, I'd like to wish everybody a happy solstice. Today's the solstice, and that's sort of the astronomy thought of the day here. Is this picture over on the right-hand side is showing a phenomenon called an analemma, and that's that funny figure 8 that you see on some old-style globes of the Earth, or maybe not so old style. And what it's depicting is some information about the motion of the sun in the sky. And this particular photo was taken by somebody snapping with a fixed camera on a tripod, I imagine. Snapping a photo every 3, 4, or 5 days, something like that, throughout the year, whenever the weather was clear. And it looks, from the fact that it's lying on its side, normally it would look like a bowling pin standing straight up, that it was taken to the east, assuming that it's somebody in the northern hemisphere. And furthermore, that they picked the days when the weather was clear. The fact that you can see the background here in this red van and everything, there's just one snapshot in the multiple exposures that had that foreground information, and so that's been added to the rest of the photos, which were probably very rapid exposures since the sun is so bright. And what happens during the year is the sun follows a funny figure 8 path in the sky if you look at it at the same solar time every day. And what it does is it goes down this arm over here on the western side, loops down in the middle of the winter at the solstice in the winter. It loops around the bottom and then starts back north on this eastern edge and comes back to north to the summer solstice up here, and then loops around the eastern side again, and it heads down back to the south. And the question is immediately asked, why does it cross over its path like that? And in fact, why does it not just move north and south? You can see why it's more southerly in the sky and more northerly in the sky easily enough, but why does it move to the east and west? And that's because you're looking at the same solar time every day. And the solar time is very regular. It's determined by atomic clocks that are quite accurate, whereas the position of the sun in the sky is determined by two things. One is by the Earth's rotation, and the other, so as the Earth speeds up or slows down, that'll wiggle the sun around a little bit. But that's not the primary cause here. The principal cause here is the fact that the sun, in its orbit around the Earth, if you want to look around at it that way, speeds up and slows down. Or conversely, that the Earth speeds up and slows down, orbiting around the sun. So in the winter, we're closest to the sun and we're going fast in our orbit. In the summer, we're going slowly in our orbit because we're farthest away from the sun. We're near aphelion. And so what happens is down in this southerly region down here, the sun is racing across, well, as the Earth orbits around the sun in the direction that it does. From our point of view, the sun is going to the east. And so each day it is a little more easterly at the same solar time. And that's what causes it to shift over in the sky. And the same phenomenon happens in the west, where the sun is actually going more slowly. It takes more than a day for it to get back to its position. And the reason it's not as pronounced here in the summer as it is in the winter is just because this motion in the near perihelion is very fast, whereas the motion near aphelion is a large arc, but it's not much of a slowdown from the mean length of day. Okay, enough astronomy. let's get on to the chess. So this was, I really should put a link in these things so that people can skip right over the astronomy if they want to and get to the chess, but you can do that with fast forward too. So I opened with d4, and we quickly got into a Slav defense. Now the last time we played Ken, I played Ken, the two of us played, he played in this position, bishop to f5, and the game went knight c3, bishop e2. I came out and attacked the bishop and actually traded it off, and that sort of determined the course of the game. This is a very common sort of pawn structure you get in these Slav defenses, and black has this open h file that he can operate along, but also where's he going to put his king? And he's, to boot, white has the bishop pair, whereas black doesn't. That didn't happen in this game at all, because what Ken chose to do instead was to play bishop to g4, pinning my knight, which is a perfectly good move and takes us into quite different territory. I immediately kicked the bishop to see whether or not it wanted to exchange itself for the knight. It didn't, so I developed some more. He continued on with his pawn triangle, and at this point, I don't know, it seemed logical to me to trade the pawns, CD, ED, and that gives us an asymmetric pawn structure. I'm not sure it's so logical as a move. The reason I did it was because well, first of all, his bishop has already been developed, so it's not a question of freeing his development by allowing this e-pawn to move. You know, normally one would not want to exchange. Oops, I'm doing it again. I'm having trouble defining my squares. There it is. The cursor appears not to be where I think it is, but anyhow, in this E6 square, let me undo colorized squares, apple Z. Okay, so we'll get rid of a few of these, and now I'll color it for you. There you go. Normally that E6 square is a barricade to the bishop, and once the bishop has been let out of the hen house, then having that pawn on E6 is no longer necessarily to white's advantage. So that's one reason I can trade the pawns, is because I'm not letting the bishop out. But, you know, what's the positive reason? Well, the positive reason was that in this position, I want to develop my bishop, my light squared bishop, to either E2 or D3. And what I didn't want to do was to move my bishop, have him take the C pawn, and then have to move again a second time to recapture. So, you know, I was trying not to lose a tempo, but the problem is this gives him probably a favorable pawn structure, and he actually ends up getting the advantage in the game. My next move was bishop e2. It's not a particularly good move, sort of dubious. Turns out that if you look at the opening library, that much favored here, and also is favored by the computer, is g4, driving the bishop back, and then followed by knight e5. And at some point I could trade the knight for his bishop, or the more aggressive move, which is the one that really leads to most advantage, is going ahead and pushing my kingside pawns right away, and threatening to trap his bishop. But, you know, I wasn't really interested in destroying my kingside that way, but after the way that the game went, I'll have to think twice about that in the future. So he played bishop d6, I castled. He played knight b d7. Let's move up a little bit here for you. Okay. And now, in this position, I thought for 12 minutes. Actually, I thought for more than 12 minutes. It turns out that in the recorded times I have for the game, that this bishop to d2 took 12 minutes, and then Ken castling afterward took 12 minutes. But in reality, what happened was I spent close to 24 minutes thinking about my move, and not realizing that Ken had not pressed the clock for the first 12 minutes. And I really wasn't trying to just burn the time on his clock, but after about 12 minutes he realized it and pressed the clock, and then I thought another 12 or 13 minutes. And the reason I thought so long is because I really didn't like bishop to d2. It's, rather than, you know, lauding its characteristics, I'd point out that the things that are wrong with it. On D2, it blocks this knight from ever coming back to D2, which might be a useful square to try to unwind this pin and also start to move my F and E pawns. Also, it blocks my queen's mobility here. My queen does have this diagonal that it can deploy along if it wants to, but you don't want to unnecessarily encumber your pieces. But the reason I did it was because I just couldn't find anything else that looked reasonable as a move for white. But a better move probably was bishop d3. I mean, I'm not even sure about that. I'm not quite sure why I put that note in there. I mean, it's an ugly position. Maybe rook c1, something like that. But it's hard to find a way that that white gets a stronger looking game. Black's pieces are just too well developed, and he just continues to develop very easily. And I struck upon an idea of trading off my light squared bishop, getting rid of that nasty pin of his by going to c2 with my queen, inviting him to attack it with his bishop, and then I would interpose my bishop in between, and he traded it off. And at this point, if you look at it with the engine, there's a slight advantage to black, less than half, well, about half a pawn. And oddly enough, it actually, as I said in the notes here, I could find it in the database. It got played once. But since it's a disadvantage for white, it's not an experiment that anybody chose to repeat. So, in this position, black really has everything they could want from an opening. And he just continued to develop freely and easily with rook to e8. Now, I came up with the idea of using a minority attack here against the 4 pawns, or really the 3. It's really 2 against 3. It's the 3 pawns on these squares are being attacked by the 2 pawns on A2 and B2, and that's a thematic idea in these sorts of pawn structures. And I expected him to play A4 to make it hard for me to try to get B4 in. He didn't do that, and I think that was a mistake. Instead, he played Queen C7. So I took time out then to develop my other rook to C1 with tempo, because I'm threatening, immediately if I want to play knight to B5, for example, because of this pinned pawn on C6. So he got off of the file and moved his queen to C8, or to B8 rather. Which then, of course, allows me to go ahead and play my B4 move, and pretty soon his queen is going to be uncomfortable on B8. He decided to try to clamp down on the B5 square so that my pawn couldn't go there, but I can simply reinforce with the A pawn, and I'm going to get that advance through anyway. So rather than sit around on the B file where my rook is going to be attacking, he moved his queen off of the B file. So at this point, white's getting a slight advantage, not much of one. I went ahead and made the pawn advance. I exchanged on B5, and now he made a move which was a little bit of a surprise to me. I really should have seen it coming. He played B5, and the reason I didn't look at it very well is because it's giving him an isolated D pawn, but it gives him a lot of play here in this position, because after I exchange the pawn, he takes back with a knight, and now my queen has to move, and he's won a tempo, and his minor pieces are quite active. He played his C knight into E4, and now I could have exchanged it off, or I could have allowed him to trade for my bishop. Instead, I chose to keep the bishop. And also, it helps to defend on E2 as well, F2. having trouble with the squares today for some reason. Okay, and he then chose to trade for that knight that was on c3. And rather than take back with my queen, I figured it was I saw this little maneuver to take back with a bishop with the idea of using it to blockade on d4. So after the knight came in, his knight came into e4, which looks like a strong square, it's supported by his pawn. It allows me to move my bishop to d4. And now I was actually quite happy with this position because it felt to me like White's structure was quite strong. So this bishop on d4 is very hard to attack. I mean, it's going to take quite a while for the knight to attack it, and probably the easiest thing he could do is try to trade off his bishop for it, but it even takes a little while to organize that. This knight on f3 is also in a strong position. It's not easily attacked. So I have a very robust kingside formation with my minor pieces, and I thought my major pieces on the queen side here could cause some damage with the open files. But that wasn't so easy to do, as you'll see. So Ken played queen to d7, and I played at this point, let's again slide up the display here. I pushed my pawn to b6. And the idea behind this was just to clamp down on his queen side and to threaten at some point to maybe invade on the c7, on this c7 square here, supported by that pawn. I can't do it right now because his bishop is guarding it, but at some point maybe I could induce him to trade his bishop for my knight or my bishop, and then I could invade with my major pieces. Meanwhile, I have a lot of space on the queen side. At least that was my thinking. For some reason, I keep losing my, jumping back in my display here. Okay, so he played his rook to c8, looking for trades, and I really don't have much option but to go ahead and allow it. He traded off a pair of rooks, and then played h6, making luft for his king, so he doesn't have to worry about his back rank. And I played my queen back to c2. Now, to be honest, I'm drifting a bit here. You know, the idea behind queen to c2 was to maintain strong control over the c file, because now he can't get away with playing his rook to c8 anymore, because I'm controlling that square. But then again, there's no easy invasion point for my major pieces along that file, and I'd have to figure out some way to trade off his bishop, like I said, before I could use that c7 square. And I was unable to do so. And it turns out that, you know, Stockfish, when I look at this position with Stockfish, it's perfectly happy with this position. So, you know, if I, let's see, look at maybe 3 lines here. So stop it there. So they're all, you know, very close to even, and doesn't come up with much of an idea for White's further play. And so I was unable to as well. And it's hard when you can't find some way to progress your game. So let's see, what I played was queen to b3. Again, I did this because the b pawn is under attack. Well, it's actually defended by my bishop though, so that's not an issue. Really, I was just making moves so that I wouldn't waste too much time here. I think I this does attack the d pawn, but this isolated d pawn. But right now, that d pawn is poisonous fruit, because it's defended indirectly by the queen, because this bishop could sacrifice itself with check on h2. So, you know, if Black just made a tempo move, like, well, this isn't any good, but say he played the king to f8, and I were so foolish as to take that pawn, then what would happen would be check. I could take it back either way, either with my knight or the king, and then he wins the queen. So that would be devastating. So queen b3 doesn't really threaten to take it, although it at least starts to put some pressure on the pawn. If I can, for example, move my king to a white square, then that would be a real threat, and he would have to unmask his defense of that pawn or risk losing it. Instead he went in for another pair of exchanges. So I didn't want to exchange at this point. Let's scroll up a little bit here. If I were to initiate the trade on c8, then he would take back with the queen, and all of a sudden he's threatening a checkmate on the back rank. I'd have to move my queen back just to defend c1. And the problem is that I don't have, is unraveling my king, because the h2 square is locked down by his bishop here, so I don't have that, even though it looks like I have Luft. If I play g3, that is a real weakening move, and there are various possibilities of sacrifices of one of his minor pieces for my two pawns there, but even more immediately, this pawn, whenever his queen is on c8 like that, the pawn will just drop if I play g3. So it's actually hard to figure out what to do over here on my king side. Now, I wasn't coming up with a reasonable solution, so instead of exchanging myself, I just went ahead and defended the rook, and he initiated the trade. And then played another move I didn't anticipate, which was to strengthen that dark square diagonal. It makes sense. I sort of threw it out of hand though, because I thought it weakened him too much along this light diagonal. But that's actually, it's hard to exploit that. So right now my queen can't go to the light diagonal, so I played queen c2 with the idea maybe of playing queen b3 as my next move. And Ken played queen d7, and the problem is that, you know, I can't organize a successful attack on that d5 pawn. You know, I could play queen to b3, but then he simply moves his king to the corner, and since I'm not taking a check, I lose. If I took the d5 pawn, it would be a fatal tactic, like I just showed you before when I took the d5 pawn. And so, as I said in my notes, I actually at this point in the game, prior to my move, after Ken's move, he only had 12 minutes left for the rest of the game. I had 24. So I felt good about my clock. But I sat there and looked for so long, and I couldn't figure out any way to progress with my queen alone and make any progress. And furthermore, I didn't have a way to deploy my minor pieces that I liked. So I came up with an idea that, you know, was better than nothing, I guess, but it's a pretty dubious idea, g4, weakening my king side. But the problem was he could have just played h5 at this point, and I was really afraid of it. Turns out it's not as bad as I thought it would be, because if he did play h5, I have the counterstroke, queen to a2, attacking his loose pawn on d5. And now if he went ahead and traded, you know, took twice on g4, well, I took once. I mean, if he played pawn takes pawn, then if he plays pawn takes pawn, yeah, if he plays pawn takes pawn, the problem is that white wouldn't take back immediately. Instead, I'd just take the d-pawn check, and the king would move, say, oh, I wouldn't move there, say to h1, and now I could take the knight, and if he takes my knight, I win a couple of pawns here, or a pawn, I guess. So something like this. So I had 4 pawns to 3. So the after g4, the h5 move doesn't work, and it's partly because of the fact that he's weak along that white square diagonal. And so, in order to solve that, he could play the king to the corner. Instead, he said, well, this is an endgame. I'll march the king to the center of the board. And that took me by surprise, but it's probably not an unreasonable move. I certainly couldn't figure out any way to really exploit it. I decided to trade off the knights, or at least offer the trade, and he continued with his king over to the very center of the board. And I then have the option. I thought that maybe I could whip up an attack on the queen side, but it turns out his queen does a fine job of defending, because I check and he interposes, and I felt like if we traded off the queens, that the game would be equal here, because both of our kings are about equally far from the action in the center. So I maneuvered a little bit, attacking his weak pawn. He defended it. And then I came back and checked him again. He sort of tacitly offered a draw. At this point, I didn't want to repeat, so I made a different waiting move. He moved his king up, and that allowed me a move to move my king up. And then he moved his king back. I attacked the weak pawn again. He defended it. I checked. He interposed. And now at this point, since my king is one square closer than it was before, I went ahead and traded queens. And I thought my king was going to be able to get into the king side and win the game here, because I figured after e4 takes, that my king now would just be able to walk over to the g file. But unfortunately, he has just enough time. So he played king to d7, and at this, well, actually, let's see, it was this point right here. After I played king takes e4, we both put our pens down. We had under 5 minutes each left, and you're allowed to, of course, stop recording at that point, which we did. And so I'm not absolutely certain of the rest of the moves of the game from here on, but I think they're very close to being right. There might be a slight transposition as to whether I move the f or h pawn first, for example, but it's basically this is what happened for the next 10 moves to the end of the game. So he played the king to e7. I advanced my pawns. He walked over with his king. I advanced my h pawn. He played king f7. I played king f5. I meant to point out, and I should point out, that instead of f4 here, after he played king d7, you might wonder, why didn't I just go ahead with my plan of infiltrating on the king side here and running in with my king? But the problem is that he can pretty easily defend. So either with the bishop or the king. But for example, he could just play king to e7, and I attack the pawn, and he plays king to f7, and I didn't really see any way to pry his position open here, because his b pawn is on a light square, and his pawns that are on the king side are all pretty strong, and I'm going to have a hard time actually threatening to win anything. The only way I can try to pry them open is to eventually advance my pawn to g5, and at that point he can just trade pawns off. So this is looked like a draw to me, and I think it is. So instead we got into this position where he checked me. I came back and he played the king out. I checked, and we traded off a pair of pawns. And now at this point, according to Stockfish, this is a dead draw, but Ken actually made a move that allowed me to win the game, which was that he moved his king back to e7. And the crucial thing here is that it's on e7, that bishop, the king is blocking the bishop's defense of the pawn on h6. And so What I want to do is attack that pawn. If I attacked it immediately, he would just advance it, and so I wouldn't be able to get it once it got to h5, and my king couldn't penetrate over there either. For example, I'll show you what that looks like. If I played bishop to e3, he could just play h5, and now there's no way to either take it with my bishop or to get my king over there either. So that would be a mistake. So instead, I played h5 to fix it on a dark square. That gives him a move, but there's not anything terribly good he can do with that move. And now in particular, he couldn't keep me from getting this diagonal I need to be on, and I can attack that pawn. He runs with his king over to my pawn on the b file, but it's just not fast enough. I take the pawn. He, I believe, attacked it with the bishop, and I came here with my bishop, and this was the end of the game. The idea being that after, well, I'm defending the pawn with my bishop. There's no way really for him to stop my h-pawn if he were to try to, if he traded the bishops off and my king took back, then he could go with his king over, just get into the square and stop my h-pawn. But meanwhile, my king would come in and mop up the other pawns, probably the b pawn, and I'd queen on b8. So it's an easy win after that. So we've gone for a while here. I think it's probably about time to wrap it up. It was a interesting, hard-fought game. A Slav defense, a little different with that nasty pin on f3. I broke the pin, but I got too congested with my bishops. He actually got a very nice playable middle game, but ended up allowing me to gain a lot of space on the queen side. And after some trades, it should have been a draw, but it wasn't, because I was able to exploit the little inaccuracy in the king and bishop endgame in order to win that pawn and get through that way. So that was my game number 2. So right now I'm 3.5 out of 4 because Paul Godin had to withdraw from the tournament, so I got a freebie credit of a win for him. So I'm 3.5 out of 4. I'm a half a game off of a perfect record, but tonight I have a very tough opponent in Brett Kildall, who's around 2,200, is a national master, and we'll see how that goes. Fortunately, I have white against him, and next week I'll let you look and see probably how Brett dismembers me, but who knows, maybe I'll pull out a good game and surprise him. So long for now.